This is the final section or the final part of this lecture. So far, we managed to introduce many of the theological movements which have recently occurred in order for the evangelical Pentecostal churches to be turned into neo Pentecostal churches, which are a singular or a sort of invention um, created here in Brazil, and that is now spreading out throughout the world. But more important than that, or most important than that, sorry, is we need to understand that neo-Pentecostal churches are in a way a symptom, right? They are not the cause of what we're actually investigating, right? What do I mean by introducing them as symptoms? In a way, neo-Pentecostal churches are a symptom of the shift from liberalism to neoliberalism. What does that mean? Is basically that the harsh passage or this change of paradigm that happened in our global economy, right? That was changing since 1980s all the way into what we have in more recent years, right? So 2020, 2010 translates this understanding that economy has to basically instead of being all delegated to employers being responsible and dealing with the organization of the employees, right? Now there is a delegation of responsibility of many of those things that were once workers' rights, and now they are diluted. They are just obliterated of our discussion or collective discussion as a society, or just simply dismissed, right? And are being placed onto the hands of the worker himself, right? So he has to fend for himself more and more. So in a way, people are turning themselves into small companies, right? So they treat themselves as little companies of themselves, which is a very problematic way of dealing with our humanity, our capacity as workers, because not everybody needs to be this autonomous liberal worker, right? At all times, but people portray themselves as if they were. So those are subjective elements that were introduced by neoliberalism. And this changes the way that we once understood how life operated in terms of labor and leisure and workers' right and the workers' movement and the organization towards workers' rights and many of the things that are now being demolished or forgotten, right? This has everything to do with the acceleration of time and the acceleration um, of capitalism under the digitalized reality that now we have and that now encompasses the entire world. So, so far, I will go a bit in depth into that, but let me just recapitulate what we've seen so far. So, Neo-Pentecostal churches, Neo-Pentecostal movement, everything that occurred here in Brazil was attempts to try to survive and to create kind of a structure for people to fend for themselves, right? So once again, uh, we must be careful here, right? Because religion offers many important things for people who have any other don't have any other possibility, don't have any other means to protect themselves, right? So this community, which established from people who have nothing, is crucial. So we cannot ignore that. And this designation was built through the cracks of the state. And the crucial element that we need to take into consideration here is that this is happening in Brazil. This happened in Brazil, but the fact that this church, right, is basically presenting itself and establishing itself on many different countries, right? It means that the same environment that made them flourish, right, that made them necessary for people, it's found in countries which basically have the same structure or have a very similar one. And those are elements that we cannot or must not ignore from our discussion, right? This is what makes it more and more clear the point that neo Pentecostal churches are nothing but a symptom, right? So they're not the cause, but they are the symptom of the neoliberal capitalist reality, which is now taking over, right? So, if we understood this point, or if this point is now clear, we can understand that when we bring Marx, right? So when we are talking about introducing Marx's lenses to talk about this, it's basically because Marx was the first one who introduced a proper critique to the difficulties of capitalism. So Marx was actually, Marx was basically trying to introduce the subjective transformation which occurs to people under capital, and the fact that capitalism itself moves in a certain kind of way that puts people against people, right? So it turns workers against each other as competitors for the same position, right? It basically naturalizes not only the indifference towards the other, it also normalizes competition, and it normalizes a lot of the troubling elements that capital requires in order to operate. One of those things are basically the economical logic of profits and the economical elements which get um, taken away from the workers as surplus. And this is something that I won't be able to go in depth, but let's just remind ourselves that Marx is not naive when he's introducing his critique. What he's saying is that it's a double-edged sword, that it offers a bomb, religion offers a bomb, but it also numbs people to what they're dealing with, right? It normalizes this harsh reality without providing the means for them to organize themselves to fight for something else, right? To find a different way of dealing with this reality, right? So we are in a way approaching neo-Pentecostal churches through Marxist lenses in order to criticize how it also numbs people in this process. And this has everything to do with the discussion which was introduced by Mark Fisher. Mark Fisher was basically a British thinker, right? This is him, by the way. He was born in 1968 in East Midlands, which is a very interesting spot in England because it was historically known for the workers' movement, and it was very. It's a place, right, which the working class was very strong. So this was the environment where he was raised, and he was in a way very familiarized with the syndical and the class struggles that were basically a part of his young years, right? And this is something that becomes clear on his texts, interviews, and many other um, pieces of information that you can find on Mark Fisher, right? So all the way into 1980s, right, when he was a teenager, it became a moment where he saw a certain destruction of the class identity, right? So more and more that possibility of you identifying yourself as a worker and just seeing another worker, and then you could just have this in common. He was noticing how this shared communal experience was just being demolished, and this was something that became a very personal element that he investigated in order to make sense. And this was one of his most um, fundamental points, which it's present in this work, Capitalist Realism, as something that he will later discuss, right? So why people just stop identifying themselves in a way as workers, right? What happened there? And well, he was also very into aesthetics and the post-punk movement that was occurring, and the independent music and many of the cultural elements that were happening in UK. And he connect everything that was a bit bleak and how this was changing. And instead of being just pessimistic towards it, he saw also glimpse of alternatives, or at least he defended that we need to invent alternatives to the problems that we face today, right? So he got in contact with the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, right, which is called CCRU, and this is where he got most in line in terms of his thinking to a more collective experience, right? And this is where the notion of acceleration start to become more and more present in his own thinking, right? When we're talking about acceleration, we're talking about the digitalization of reality and how this transformation of our world into data, and how the mathematical models translate everything that we see into the machine, and how that was being formulated was in a way inspiring to Mark Fisher, because he saw in that a possibility of providing more time for people to actually live their lives, right? Instead of just doing things that were basically unnecessary. And this is a point that Marx himself already made in the past, right? So uh, he saw in that a glimpse um, of, of I wouldn't say optimism, but he saw something which could be fruitful in there. The problem is that rather quickly, Mark Fisher noticed that capitalism um, it's created by people, and people need to be against its excesses, right? And if we leave it up to sorry, and if we just leave it, right, leave capitalism to work by itself. So if we delegate it to the machines and to the computers, they will in a way operate without us, and we will just tend to normalize it more and more. And the way that it is constructed, right, it's a it's a system which is now present all over the world, and it introduces differences and disparities which are becoming more and more difficult to be fought against, right? So he became rather critical of this blind acceleration movement and start to defend a leftist perspective to accelerationism, right? So a critical perspective to this acceleration of time and its effects over people, right? So Fisher had, in a way, we could put four different or phases could be a way of addressing, but four main influences. The first one would be Spinoza and this cybernetic model, right? Which we can clearly see um, as a primary uh, influence from this CCRU movement. The second phase concerns the sorry, the psychoanalyst influence of Jacques Lacan. So psychoanalysis became a very significant part of his trajectory. The third part concerns Antonio Gramsci, which is a Marxist uh, thinker, and he also introduces a lot of the collective ideas that will be present in Fisher's thinking. And the fourth one concerns Habib Marcuse, who is a thinker of the Frankfurt School. So it's a critical thinker and a very fascinating one, which also brought a lot of this articulation between Marx and psychoanalysis to his own line of thinking, right? So I know that Cindy introduced some texts to you, right? And those are basically some of the influences that you can, in a way, find through those pages, right? But he was he has a lot of work that was published, and unfortunately, he took his life in January 13 of 2017. And like I said, I guess I said this at the beginning of this lecture, but if I haven't, because I took a few takes to record this lecture, I was able to translate his work. Right now, I'm translating another of his books, but I translated this book, Capitalist Realism, to Portuguese, and I think that getting in touch with this work was very significant in a way that we're dealing with contradictions, and there is this overall idea, right, which is a passage from another North American thinker, Jameson, who says it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And Mark Fisher took this passage as a philosophical problem to every single text that he wrote, right? So why it's just easier for us to end with the ecology, we end the world, we end our civilization, we just normalize wars, we just organize everything to end the world, but we cannot seem to surpass the economical system which is placed to work, right? Especially if we know that historically speaking, capitalism wasn't always there, right? It was invented, it was meant to be surpassed, right? It was meant to be a moment, but it never went away. And why is that, right? So, capitalist realism is basically Mark Fisher's concept or notion to translate this perspective of just telling about reality or telling about everything that we know about the world under the perspective of capitalism, right? So it's almost as if we attach reality to capitalism in a way that they are so intertwined that we cannot see one without each other, right? So this is his provocation, right? Why is that? Uh, can we not think of an alternative to it? What it's actually going on here, right? So this book, it's from 2009, right? And basically, there are a couple of elements, right? Examples here and there, which maybe are a bit old. I don't know if everybody is familiarized with the references that he uses, but I think those are easy to find, right, for those who were interested about it. But the key element here is that all the way into I don't know 60s and 70s, right, until the end of the USSR, what we had in the world was basically a narrative that was fighting a war, ideologically speaking, between two understandings or two ways of seeing the world. And after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, it's almost as if the capitalist perspective prevailed and there's nothing else, right, that can be understood in a different manner. And this is something that it's quite curious, right? Why is that? Why every single attempt or experimentation, and I'm thinking about like socially speaking, right, or collectively speaking, of trying to do something else, got demolished or just swept to under the rug, and we cannot think about other possibilities, especially when capitalism in itself operates causing so much disparity, causing so much domination of people over people, countries over countries, and it's structured itself in a way that makes life so much difficult, right? Of course, there are many significant things that capitalism brought to our reality. I'm not denying that. I mean, we cannot be naive about it. But the point is that now we do have means to think about different ways to approach our reality. Why don't we take this next step towards something else and invent something else? And those are a couple of the provocations that he introduces to us, right? Why are we so close to do things almost in a Neolithic kind of way, right? Why do we just insist or persist into doing things in such manner? So those are a couple of the elements that he introduces to us, especially when colonization just became new colonization under this capitalist realism, right? So what is going on that we normalize rules of domination, and we need to actually just take a closer look to it, especially because it does have a lot of implications in the way that we live our lives. So capitalism realism is his way of approaching this debate, and saying how this um, makes us short-sighted to inventing different futures or inventing alternatives to the problems that we face nowadays. And we're talking about the ecological collapse of the world, especially when we only have this world. I know that billionaires are trying to colonize other countries, and that's just sad. For sorry, they already did that. So billionaires are actually trying to colonize different planets. I do feel sad for those planets because to bring capitalism to Mars, the only thing that I can say to that is I pity Mars because looks what it's doing to Earth, right? So that's something that I know it's a bit tragic, but that's something very serious, right? I mean, they're basically saying to everybody else that they're giving up on this planet, right? I mean, they understand that things are not going so well in terms of resources, natural resources, and they are actually finding a way to make capitalism work, right? Uh, from a different planet, right? That's something that we are talking about here, right? It's easier to imagine the end of the world than to end this system that takes all over our reality, right? So the chapters that I asked you to read and to follow because I think that they are valid for a discussion. There are a couple of elements here and there which I think are very significant to our discussion when we're talking about religion, right? The first one has something to do with the super identification of capitalism, right? And although it does not need to be the case, it persists, right? So, why is that? One of the elements is that capitalism or capitalist realism, as Fisher defends, found a way of diluting its critique as a narrative which is reintegrated to capitalist realism itself, right? So, how does that appear in real life, right? I know this is not one of the examples that he uses in the book, but I think it's a very valid one. Think of those very anti-capitalist movements like punk or like bands which are very critical of capitalism, and all of a sudden you can actually buy one of their shirts on like very famous brands, and like Zada or H&M and whatever. Um, that's kind of a very peculiar contradiction, which illustrates this point, right? But I think that his example in the book is very good, right? Which is the film, the Disney Pixar Wall-E from 2008, and I think it's a very, very cool way of dealing with this problem, right? Um, we delegate the critique to the cultural industry, right? So we see a film criticizing the way that big companies are destroying our environment or just ending nature. And we watch this film talking about it, and in a way, we just calm ourselves because we are delegating this critique to this film. And when we see it, we identify with it, we agree with it. But after we watch it, it's not like we are just going outside the movies or going outside the cinema and like, I need to do something about it. This is they're right, right? They're absolutely correct. The world is going to this natural collapse. I need to organize myself and do something about it, right? I need to start something. No, it's actually the other way around. You watch the film and you just feel relieved, right? You feel good that, wow, you make comments about it, you post something on Instagram, whatever, on Twitter, X, You just uh, I don't know, trash the film, or you just agree with the film and you pose a very positive critique to it, and that's it, right? So you talk about things, but you don't necessarily do anything about it. And this is an anti-capitalist narrative. It's an anti-capitalist point which the film presents, and we don't do nothing when we get in contact with it. And this super identification, it's a way of numbing ourselves, right? And this is actually something very interesting about this point. And what Mark Fisher is bringing forward is that we kind of lost the subjective attitude of trying to do something, right? Because we delegate our beliefs to others, and we delegate our beliefs of changing things to experiences that we consume in our daily life. And by doing so, we miss the opportunity or even the will of trying to act upon those anti-capitalist um, remarks or things that we just cannot agree with, right? So, in a way, we see this taking place, and we just place ourselves in this ironic distance, right? Uh, on things that we don't necessarily believe, but they operate for themselves. So it's almost as if we just become a bit cynical, or just a bit ironical or ironic towards a couple of things, like capitalism itself or how money operates. And by doing so, we are attributing this holy value to those elements, right? So they are kind of untouchable. And it's almost as if even if we don't do nothing about it, it will just work uh, in the same manner, right? A good example from this other philosopher, Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, is that it's almost like the justice system, right? People don't necessarily believe that everything occurs in a very correct manner, right? There are corruptions here and there, and people, if we talk to each other, they will see that, oh, they don't believe it, but it will work nonetheless, right? It's almost as if people couldn't necessarily do nothing about it, right? Or if they just give up um, trying to do something, it will operate for itself. So this delegation of our beliefs shapes the way that reality persists on not changing, or persists on just keeping things as they are. And those are very interesting subjective elements that occur. And delegation, it's something which is quite interesting if we pay attention to it, right? A good example of delegation, which is related to religion, it's a Brazilian one that I actually adapted, and I'm writing about it right now. I think you've seen this before, right? Zizek, this philosopher, would talk about the Buddhist wheel, right? So you write something down that it's like a prayer. You write it down. You put that into a little Buddhist wheel, and it's just turning, right? And it's praying for you, right? So you don't have to do it. If we look to Christianism and Christianity, something that we see in Catholicism and works in the same manner are the candles, right? When you light up a candle, right, you don't stay there praying until the candle is gone, right? You light up the candle, and the candle, in a way, right, it's doing the prayer for you, right? So it's praying for you. So you delegate that prayer to the candle, and the candle is actually doing the work. So you can actually enjoy yourself and do things which are more important to you, or just kind of more significant, like working and so on and so forth. So it's kind of interesting when we pay attention to delegation of belief and how does that participate in our own lives, right? So well, with that being said, Mark Fisher is very attentive to the importance of reclaim a real political agency, right? So we need to break free from those traps that impose that we don't have nothing that we can do about reality as it is, right? So every single time that we find ourselves being cynical towards reality or keeping this ironic distance to things, we are, in a way, just brutalizing our affects. We are brutalizing our feelings, and we are just giving up on the possibility of changing things, right? So we just need to find better ways to break out from this imaginary uh, wall that we just put in front of reality as it is, in order to regain real political agency towards that which um, dominates us, right? One crucial element into this discussion is Fisher's definition of reflexive impotence, right? So this is a quote from him. So they know things are bad, but more than that, they know that they can do anything about it, right? So this particular bleak perspective on reality is something that we need to pay attention to. And we were talking about symptoms, and we were talking about psychological difficulties which are presented to us. This is where you can see people's bodies falling ill because of the way that our economy is structured, right? And Fisher is paying attention to that, talking about young people in England, right, which is a very wealthy country. Imagine how things are in poor countries, right? Imagine how things are where the struggle to have the means is much harsher, right? So, in a way, um, when Fisher is talking about this epidemic of depression, this endemic um, surface of this health mental disease, right? He's just noticing that more and more what is going on is that we see this normalization of this pathologization of reality, right? So people get more and more used to being classified or approached to a certain specific mental health uh, disease, right? And we normalize that, and in a way, this is something that is crucial because it's completely in line with the neoliberal agenda or the neoliberal ideology, which makes this privatization of problems, right? So when you're suffering about something that is happening on your school, on the university, on work, or whatever, instead of finding means to actually deal with those issues, right, which are socially constructed and which are completely connected to this more broad economical system, we think that the problem lies within our own bodies, right? So you are not adapting yourself enough to this brutal reality. So you need to compensate that by changing your brain's chemistry to survive this harshness, right? But if we understand that, we can actually hear how crude and brutal this actually is, right? We are just saying that you need to dehumanize yourself more in order to be able to survive reality as it is, right? So this is the level of contradiction that we now deal in our daily lives, and this is something that Mark Fisher is quite exceptional in terms of being able to write it down and put into this book, right? Another element which is completely in line with this is that dealing with such contradictions, it's not absurd that we find people more and more used to do this pursuit of pleasure at all costs, right? So it's almost as if you can not do anything else but pursue for pleasure, right? And if you're not enjoying yourself, there's something wrong with you, right? So this imperative of always having to enjoy yourself, it's also a symptom of our contemporary reality. And this, once again, changes the way that we deal with ourselves. And this is something that we need to pay attention to because it changes the way that we deal with ourselves and how we deal with our society in terms of collectives and groups and so on. So, another crucial element of this pathologization of reality is that it basically prevents people from organize themselves in a different manner, right? So this is something that capitalist realism, right, or this overall structure was very meticulous in order to deorganize people of finding collective answers to the issues which they collective suffer from. So, in a way, this resistance to something new, right? It's something that Mark Fisher is very attentive to, right? To invent something else or to find an alternative. And although it can be um, this in a way uncomfortable, right? This is something that we need to put in place or just seek for, right? So we need to invent new languages to deal with the conditions that we are now facing, right? So this is a part of this quote, and I think it's a very relevant one, which is it is important to contest capitalism's appropriation of the new, but to reclaim the new can be a matter of adapting to the conditions in which we find ourselves. Uh, we've done that rather too well, and successful adaptation is the strategy of managerialism par excellence. Sorry for mispronouncing that. It's a difficult word in English for me. But that's the thing. There isn't a strategy behind dealing with things in this manner. And we need to find another invention to our way of dealing with collectivity. Good. So uh, I wanted to bring forward a lot of those elements from Mark Fisher because I think that in a way he can bring us back to the importance of finding those symptoms and instead of just normalizing them, seeing that we need to invent alternatives to them, right? And going back to our main topic, right? Neo-Pentecostal churches, they only got established in the way that they did because the state was not there for those people, right? So it organized itself in a way that it did, and it now has the power which it has basically because it had the means to do it, but also people had no other alternative instead of just fending for themselves, right? So instead of just being completely brutal about those things, which would be stupid of us, right? What we need to understand is that how can we actually uh, invent alternatives to find new communal values where a church can be only a church, right? Or where religion can be just religion and not completely perverted by capitalism, right? So, in a way, religion itself is lost, right? And I think that if we understand that, we might be able to invent something else, right? So if we manage to break religion free from capitalism, religion will be something else, right? And this does not mean that we need to weaponize religion or do something else. I'm quite against that discussion. We don't need to use religion at all. But what we need to do is to invent other possibilities of collectivization which can capture materialistic problems and deal with that in such manner that people won't necessarily need to find uh, just side alternatives or just invent new alternatives to them, right? So this is what I wanted to introduce to all of you. Once again, I apologize for not being there with you live and just talking to all of you and getting your questions and reactions and critiques. By the way, if you have critiques, write me as well. I would love to hear what you have to say to this presentation. This is an ongoing research. There are a lot of elements that I put into this mosaic, right? But I hope that you can actually see the big picture that I'm trying to organize here in order to see how complex it is to deal with this particular religious branch and the importance of finding like socio-economical alternatives to it so that people can actually just enjoy their lives in a different manner and basically have a proper way of dealing with their problems instead of just going back to the church for the church to actually provide for them alternatives once again because they're already paying for it, much like when you see Uber or any other big tech, right? So people want Uber to be in their countries instead of actually mobilizing themselves to have better um, public transportation that works or something like that. So instead of delegating to capitalism to find the solutions to the problems it causes, we need to invent solutions which are um, creative to us humans. So we need to invent alternatives to the way that we treat ourselves. And I think that this is something that I wanted to introduce to you today. Thank you so very much for your patience. I know that I took a lot of time, but I hope this was fruitful and something that you can also understand within your own reality and see how this can be occurring in New Zealand right now and how can you also introduce something which is actually new and not a new under capitalistic terms. So thank you so very much once again. Thank you, Cindy Zeiher, for this opportunity. I hope that I get a chance to be next year with you again and to have this conversation with your students on this future opportunity. And I want to thank the class and everybody who's listening, Canterbury University, for the opportunity as well. Thank you so very much.